today's webinar. Just to remind us that this is actually a meeting, not a webinar. That means we cannot control you, we cannot control your voice and video, but we ask that you please stay on mute at all times. If you have any questions, you will type them in the chat, and so that we can give our speakers opportunity to share what they have to share with us. So welcome with me, Mark, Linus, Pablo Orozco, and Ia is yet to join us for today's webinar. I would like to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. I'll start with Mark. Also, just to mention that we are streaming live on YouTube, and that is where the recording will also stay after this.
Oh, hi, Patricia. I was actually just texting Ia to say it's now. She thought it was in an hour, so she'll be joining us pretty promptly, I imagine. Nice to see you again. Hi, Pablo. Great to see you as well. We're all colleagues from the
give our speakers opportunity.
Oh, is that more voices from Patricia? Always lovely to hear. Anyway, so I'm Mark Linus. I've been working on climate for I think it's almost a quarter of a century. I know I don't look that old, but my first COP was it was COP6 in 2000 in The Hague. So that just goes to show I haven't been to every single COP. I'm not that sad, but I have been to quite a number over the years. So I'm a bit of a COP veteran, and I've also been from attending from different perspectives. So I've been there as a media representative. I've also been there as an activist campaigner, and I've also been as a country delegate. So I've sort of seen the different sides behind the COP curtain, if you like, which hopefully will be useful to share some reflections on later.
Thank you, Mark. COP, what does COP mean for those of us who are new to this?
You asking me?
Yes, I am.
It means Convention of the Parties, and so it's not just the Climate Convention that has a COP. The Biodiversity Convention has them as well. I think, Pablo, you should talk about this because you're the international negotiations expert, and you know more about these processes than I do. So I would hand over the expertise on COPery to Pablo for that.
Sure, happy to take them, and very happy to see Patricia and Mark. It's such a gift to be able to spend time with past colleagues. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about who I am first, and then I'll go and get into that question, Patricia. So my name is Pablo Orozco. I'm an international lawyer. I specialize in biosafety systems, but I've been following the biodiversity COP, or the Convention of Biological Diversity, for a long time, since Cancun, since the first COP I went to was in Cancun in 2016. So also kind of a veteran. And so to answer your question, Patricia, these COPs come from international agreements. So you'll have international agreements, for example, the Convention of Biological Diversity, which is very different from the climate COP. The Convention of Biological Diversity's objectives are to promote the conservation of biodiversity and the sustainable use of its components. And at the same time, it tries to guarantee that whoever uses biodiversity shares benefits accordingly. And so the COP is the conference of the parties. In international agreements, you'll have all the different countries will agree to join this international agreement, and the COP is the conference is basically when they all get together, and they're the key group that makes decisions to implement these international agreements. And yes, as Mark said, I've always gone to the COP of the Convention of Biological Diversity, but Mark and other colleagues here, I believe, are experts in the climate COP, which that specific objectives I'll leave for them when they discuss that.
Sure. Pablo, thank you very much for that overview. I don't know whether Ia is online, but I guess we can start. Since this, Ia is here. Please introduce yourself. Great. I think you're muted, so just tell us a little bit about who you are and your COP history.
So my name is Ia Anstud. I'm a youth activist, and I've attended COP27 and COP28, and as well as COI 18. That's the Conference of Youth that is held before COP to deliver the message from the world youth. So that's my experience with COP, and I've also done some actions there to and managed to get some changes through in the language of the final implementations plans at COP27.
Great. So thank you very much. I see that most people who have joined us will basically fall into the category of observers, participants who just going to listen to the process and contribute, not necessarily the people who are drafting the regulations. So we are going to keep our conversation to the ordinary participants who will just walk into the blue zone, and what should they do when they get there? A little bit of more background. This year, like Mark said, there is not just COP29, which is the UNFCCC one, the one for climate, which is very popular. That is happening in Azerbaijan. And there is also the CBD that Pablo talked about of biodiversity. And then that's happening in Colombia at the end of this month. And early December, we are going to have the desertification one that will be happening in Saudi Arabia. But all these COPs have one thing in common. All these delegates get together to talk about policies and actions that can help us to keep our world or our climate cool. So it's all about climate change. Biodiversity is also still working towards halting or reducing the speed at which we are warming our world. UNFCCC, that is very clear, and desertification. So it's all about climate change. Now I would like to ask my first question, which I would like to believe that is the most exciting bit of the webinar. Starting with you, Mark. All of you will answer the same question. May you please share a memorable experience from a COP you've attended? Mark, because you've attended so many, we are going to give you 3 memorable experiences that you've attended. And how did it shape your understanding of the climate crisis and your current approach to advocacy?
I'm not sure I'll do 3, but I'll do one, which was a big one, okay? And this was in the 2009 COP in Copenhagen. And I was actually there with then President of the Maldives, Mohammed Nasheed, and I was there as his climate advisor. So I was a delegate for the Maldives, although not officially a negotiating delegate. But it did mean that I went around with him everywhere. And one of the features of COPs is that while the formal business is conducted in big plenaries where every country has a right to be there and every country has a right to speak, in reality, the outcomes of the negotiations are drafted in much smaller groups and agreed politically in much smaller groups, which tend to be invite only. And so there's a big issue there of inclusion, if you like. And at Copenhagen, this was a very political issue. And I found myself with President Nasheed in a heads of state only meeting, although heads of state were allowed to bring an advisor, which is why I was in the room. Alongside, literally, there was 30 or so people in this very, very small, hot room in the Copenhagen Conference Center. President Obama was there, Angela Merkel was there, Jacob Zuma was there from South Africa. So all the big representatives were there on the front table, and me and all the other sort of advisors were standing behind. And of course, these are completely closed door meetings. There's no media there. There's no observers at all. Certainly no NGOs. But actually, what went on in the COP, what went on in that meeting was really quite extraordinary. You might remember back in Copenhagen, the outcome was really negative. It was seen as being a big failure. And at that heads of state meeting, I had the privileged view really of what was going on. And actually, it was China, which was the main blocker of the negotiations at that point. Things have changed since, but back then it was China with the sort of petro states and the G77 who were really opposing any kind of action, even when the US was, under President Obama, was prepared to put forward more positive policies. But nobody knew this, and so in fact, all the media when this came out were blaming the wrong people, and so I actually published a full-page article in the Guardian of what actually happened at the heads of state meeting. So basically, completely disobeying all rules, really, of international negotiations of confidentiality and privacy, of literally reporting verbatim what had been said by several heads of state in a closed-door meeting. Even more extraordinarily, I was given the go-ahead to do this by the Maldives government, by President Nasheed, who just didn't give a damn, really, and even the foreign ministers. They had a cabinet meeting and they signed off my Guardian piece and let me go ahead with doing this. Yeah, complete rebel. And it actually did have an impact because Hillary Clinton picked it up. I remember it was in her memoirs even. Actually, no, it was in the cables that were released by WikiLeaks. So it was a big topic of discussion, and that really kind of changed the tone of the negotiations. So the following COP, China wanted to be much more positive. And actually after that, it did help, I think, lay the groundwork for the kind of the US China agreement, which then laid set the foundations for Paris. And so this was my one and only major intervention in the COP process, which was completely breaking all the rules, but did have an impact, I believe, on the whole kind of future trajectory of the climate change process. It's probably the most significant thing I've ever done in my life. So that's why I'm going to do any one of these things. I don't think you need two more.
Sure, great. That sounds truly most memorable. But two things before we move on to the next speaker. Are you then suggesting that the rest of us who go in as observers and all these other badge titles are kind of wasting our time if we aren't in the closed door meetings? And second, how did that change your own approach to maybe climate advocacy or COP advocacy, knowing what you learned that day?
I mean, everybody has a different role to play in the COP negotiations, and it depends what hat you're wearing. If you're an activist, then you can do actions and you can shout and you can drop banners and you can try and gain attention in other ways. If you're a delegate, your job is to try and have an impact on in these closed door sessions, and then by doing that have an impact on the actual outcome. But you've got to be a player, and this is one of the things. It's difficult to sort of sum up how it is, but some people have more influence than others, not necessarily even by what countries they represent, but they just do by dint of their personalities or their international standing or something. Like now, for example, Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, she's a real player. You know, she represents a perspective of lots of countries, and she's somebody who's really been out there and made some strong statements and pushed a strong agenda on debt negotiations and financing and stuff like that. So if you're a player, you can have a really big impact. And if you're an advisor to a player, as I was in 2009, then you can have a sort of a different impact as well. So really, it's very situational. It depends how you find yourself. I've been to lots of COPs since where I've had no impact whatsoever, and just been reporting or just been, doing stuff behind the scenes in run-of-the-mill way like everyone else does. So it's just literally about, I think, seizing an opportunity which comes up really very, very infrequently in that particular case. And what was your second question?
How it changed your own, if at all, it changed your own advocacy approach?
Well, it's just, I'm not there as an advocate. If you're there as a country representative, then you have to hold the line of that country. If you're in a speaking role, and if you're not, you have to do your best in whatever room you're in to support the negotiating lines, which are both of that country as a individual entity and of the country groups that it's a member of. So you'll probably know there's all these different groups. No countries really act on their own. All the developing countries are in the G77 plus China. AOSIS is the group for the small island states. LDCs is the least developed countries, so on and so forth. I think the umbrella group used to be the term. I don't know if it's still current or not, with Australia, the US. So the rich countries, the EU has its own groups as well. So no country acts alone, and so you have to negotiate a fine balance really between defending the positions of your country and of the groups that you're a member of, and also allowing enough flexibility that you can actually have an outcome into the negotiations which moves things forward in some way.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Pablo, do you need me to read the question again for you? Your most memorable COP and how it shaped your understanding of the climate or biodiversity crisis for you and your approach to advocacy, if at all you are in advocacy.
Yeah, so I think my most memorable one was the last one I went to, which was a COP that happened in Montreal, COP 15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And that was a mess because it was initially supposed to be in Kunming, China, but because of the pandemic, it changed and it ended up being in Canada. So very cold. But I think the most memorable part of it was we worked very hard to do a side event. And this side event included, I participated as an observer, a mere mortal in comparison with Mark's story. It's not as glamorous, but and I think that's what I liked about it, that I am just I'm registered as an observer, as a public sector researcher, for example. And I think we worked very hard to talk to parties, to talk to other observers, and try and organize a side event. Now, a side event, for those of you who don't know, is basically a small event that happens on the sidelines of negotiations. And that's probably where observers try to get in a word. And if you have something very relevant for the negotiations, you can try and get the side event to present your research, your thoughts, or something that you think would be helpful for the negotiators. And so I think it was the most memorable for me because the side event was basically trying to join different countries in one message. And I love the fact that it was Argentina, Brazil, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and Kenya, and so Patricia and Mark know this, but I do love this idea of these different continents coming together and presenting one message united. And I think I loved seeing that panel because at COPs, you have all of these developing countries. So, for example, the UK, Germany, the US, they've got so many delegates. They've got so many people there working, getting things done. And some of our countries, for example, I'm from Guatemala. And so, for example, the delegation of Guatemala will have maybe 3 delegates for a whole COP. So it's very difficult for these countries to basically just do the work necessary to have impact. So I think that was the most memorable one for me because I felt like we also gave a platform for these countries to get together, have one concise message. And I love the fact that years after, a couple of days ago, I got this message from this friend of mine in Argentina saying, listen, the Kenyan delegation is here. And they're working together on technology transfer. And I had nothing to do with it. This message came a couple of days ago, like I mentioned, and I love the fact that seed that was planted of these different countries trying to help each other out to have a united message from that we don't have that much resources could also have impact way after. So I think that was my most memorable one, and a shout out to Arif I see because he was an splendid speaker there representing Bangladesh. Oh, I'm sorry. The way it shaped I think the second one was
your advocacy.
yes.
Yeah.
I think I kind of covered that. I think it changed my way of thinking that observers could have an impact. I think that was the take-home message that I got. I know there's other questions. I'll go more in depth into how I think observers can have impact. But I think that was the first COP where I said, I'm just an observer. I registered like everyone else, but you can actually have a strong impact in not just having your message delivered to the negotiators, but also serving as a bridge between the different countries to have them talk to each other. So I think that's the most impactful way that it changed my thoughts.
Great, thank you, Pablo. You've acknowledged what Arif has said in the chat, that we shouldn't just be concerned about the plenary and the closed door meetings, the pre-COP events, the side events. They are always great opportunities for us to participate in. And Ia, if we could go to you shortly.
Yeah, so I think that as observers, it's important to still keep an eye on the plenary events because you can have an impact there. And I'd like to tell the story of how I had an impact there. So at my first COP, which was COP27 in Egypt, I was winging around there, a very lost 17-year-old with a bunch of people. I had no idea who they were, and it was my first time away from my parents, and it was a wonderful chaos. And as I was traveling home, all the media were talking about how the draft of the implementation plan, which is this big plan they released from the COP, which is saying like, what are we going to do in the coming years to actually do something about all the shit we've said. So they released this big draft of it, and all the media had clearly found it, but nobody I was talking to had actually seen the draft. So I started searching through the UN databases, and if anyone has ever searched through a UN database, you know that it's hell. It took like 4 hours to find this one document that I needed, but eventually I found it, and I read it, and this was the last draft before the final document was supposed to be taken. And it was just a few hours before COP ended, and I was at the airport. But in the draft, it said renewable energy, not clean energy. So I wrote to a bunch of people, both in the Swedish government, I knew some people, and also to one of the large pro-nuclear coordination chats that we had. And because of that, when I landed in Sweden, like 12 hours later, the headlines in all the world media was COP negotiations delayed by 3 hours. And eventually, when they did take the document, it said clean energy, not renewable energy. So it is worth keeping an eye on the actual plenary meetings, because my message reached all the way to the White House and then back to COP. And the White House was like, oh, we hadn't thought about that at all. So it's really important to keep an eye as observers. That is what we're actually there to do. It's to keep an eye on these plenary meetings, because the politicians are busy as fuck with all those side events and private closed door meetings and all of that. So it's really important to be willing to take an eye on the plenary sessions and really nitpick them, because the observations that you make there can really impact the end outcome of the event. And I think that really showed like what an impact observers have.
Great. Thank you. So what we're all saying is that it's all important. Plenaries, side events, pre-COPs, maybe they're even post-COPs, even conversations that you hold with people after, you know, at the end of the day, on your way back home. The impact doesn't stop when you are there, it continues. So I guess we are all saying that it all matters, and you can participate wherever it is that you feel comfortable. Please feel free to ask your questions in the chat. I will ask them as we go along, so that we have more of a conversation instead of, you know, us talking to you. So Daniel from Kenya is asking, there have been very many COPs in different parts of the world. Have they ever come up with a solution for climate change? And if yes, why aren't these solutions released to the people for action? There are more questions. I will give that to Mark, who has been to very many COPs in different parts of the world.
So obviously there's no single solution to climate change. I mean, it's about eliminating fossil fuels and deforestation and changing land use and agriculture. So it's a very big systemic issue with lots and lots of different solutions and lots of different challenges all the way along. And the points of COPs really isn't to come up with single solutions to even things like climate change. They basically outline what the international community has agreed to in terms of, generally in terms of targets. So the Paris Agreement in 2015, which was a COP outcome and probably the most important one in recent years, had in its outcome document that that the world was committed to keeping global temperatures well below 2 degrees, and with efforts to stay at 1.5 degrees. And so that kind of 1.5 degree Paris target has become politically very powerful and is then used everywhere in terms of financing or advocacy or other kind of political processes to show what the global target is. Essentially, it's the world agreeing to something, the world agreeing to collective action to achieve a certain outcome, which in the case of Paris was to try and keep global temperatures below 1.5. So that's the solution. They don't tell you how to get there, and there might be lots of different processes which try and assist that transition process away from fossil fuels. like, you know, carbon financing and all this kind of stuff, and technology transfer and all of this. So there's loads and loads of different streams, and it's really complicated and actually impossible to keep tabs on them all. There's also a whole thing about deforestation or reducing deforestation emissions as well, which in fact overlaps with the biodiversity COP, I think, to a significant extent. So there's just huge amounts of complexity in this. It's a very classic international negotiation, particularly the climate one. And the actual language in these outcome documents is only really, you can only understand the significance if you're a trained lawyer like Pablo and you know what the different words mean. You know what the difference is between shall and should, for example, which are, you know, incredibly important, which word is chosen for the outcome document, right? So but that's what they're for. They're there to deliver a political mandate essentially to the world to achieve a certain outcome. And so that's what you're looking for with climate change.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Most of my questions have been answered in one way or another. So what am I going to do for the next 29 minutes? Pablo, you have talked about getting different stakeholders together and things like that. So my next question goes to you. And it says, how do you build relationships with policymakers and other key stakeholders? I'm certain this doesn't happen both at COP and before. Yeah. Yes, and also talk to us about if someone wants to organize a side event, how would you go about that?
With gladly. So I think the first thing I would say is that COP is a marathon, not the 100-meter dash. And what I mean by that is think about COP as the last part of a huge marathon, where you have to really start the work way back. And so you kind of have to prepare a lot. You have to know your terrain, know your strengths and weaknesses, and really put in the work. Now, I've never ran a marathon in my life, but I have been to a couple of COPs. And so when I say be prepared, I think that, and this goes to your question, how do you make connections? How do you have impact in these negotiations? And what I would say is, first, you have to know the terrain. So first, know the issues. These events are monsters. There's so many things going on. There's so many things happening. And there's so many different documents that you should read in order to be prepared. But try and think about what it is you're most interested in. If you're a researcher, if you're an activist, what is it that matters to you, and zero in on that and go directly to the documents and try to understand as much as you can of that document and know what you want to say. That's, I think, the first thing before you start the marathon. Then you have to understand the players, like Mark said. So you'll have parties, which are the countries. And for them, you have to understand who's responsible for what, because you'll have national focal points. Sometimes different government institutions from your country will be responsible for some things, and sometimes others will be responsible for others. So if I go to you and you're the Ministry of Environment and I want to talk to you about technology transfer, and I make all this effort and finally get to talk to him, he's not going to know about what I'm talking about because he's not the one in charge of that. So that's very important for you to pay attention to. And then in terms of observers, I would say this is very important. There's strength in numbers. And there's a huge different types of observers that could be NGOs, research institutions, or indigenous people and local communities. And they all have a community. So pay attention to look at those communities. And all of these communities, it's hard to find, but they do have places where you can plug in. So know your issue. Know who the players are, parties versus observers, and make use of their starting points. And the last point that I would say is engage. Don't be afraid to engage. Send an email to the contact point asking specific question about your theme, or send an email to organizations that are already in the game so you can piggyback off of their expertise to inform yourself. So for example, for those of you attending the COP, the Convention on Biological Diversity in Colombia, I'm part of a network that's called the DSI Scientific Network. And so we regularly do events for researchers that work with DSI to plug into what the conversation is going. Whatever your issue is, there's a high probability that somebody already is doing something. So plug in there. So I think that's what I would say for your first question. And your second question was, Patricia?
How to organize a side event. No, not the nitty-gritty of invite people, but really, this is really about getting a room, getting space.
Yes.
And you've talked about how to get the panelists.
So pick something exciting that has relevance on the negotiations. Because if you just want to present something that sounds great to you, but that has no direct relevance to the negotiations, then you probably won't be picked up. Second, there's strength in numbers. Usually what the COPs do, I'm not sure for the climate COP, but I'm certain for the conventional biological diversity, what the secretariat does is it tries to pair groups. So if I want to give a side event on deforestation and 4 or 5 other people want to do the same thing, they'll try and get them together so that they can have a joint side event. And the more institutions that are applying together, the more chances you will have of getting a spot. On top of that, if you have the connections, another great thing to do is to have one of the parties be co-developer of your side event. So if there's a flag somewhere in there that a party is trying to get the side event, your chances of getting the side event goes up. And the last thing I think I'll mention is that there's different approaches to observers taken by different parties. So for example, Canada really just includes researchers or indigenous people in local communities or activists as part of their delegation. So try your luck. Which one is your country? Approach them and say that you're going to the COP and ask about how to be part of your delegation. You may be surprised.
Thank you, Pablo. Before we continue, I'd also like to share, I attended, last year was actually my first COP, COP28, which was in Dubai. And thankfully, I have heard that it was the COP that was most attended. It had the greatest number of people. But I actually got a room, and it was extremely easy. I was actually shocked at how easy it was. Maybe because in Dubai we had just so much space going on. So usually there are forms at the entrance. You go in and request a room. They prefer that you request a day before. So if you want your side event to be on the 2nd, you ask on the 1st. And UNFCCC usually has a lot of space, and they grant that. They will confirm the next day by 8 a.m. So if you haven't been able to do the background work like Pablo is telling us, still last minute, at least for UNFCCC, that is now becoming very huge, you can always get a room last minute. But of course, there are the challenges of advertising and getting people into the room. But that is where social media comes into play. It doesn't mean that everything that is happening at COP has to be targeted at the people who are physically present. You can actually loop in the rest of the world using social media. So our next question, I think, yes?
Just to add to that, Patricia, we once filmed a very impressive press conference in an entirely empty room. Like, no journalist came at all, but you won't be able to tell that if you look at the photos that we took of us, like sitting on the dais, making our speeches with the big, like UNFCCC banners in the background. So even an empty room can be useful if you don't turn the camera around.
Yeah, sure. And the rest of us who watched it were absolutely impressed. We're like, how did Mark pull this off? Until they told us the room was empty. So yes, you can do something like that. This question goes to Ia. Samuel here is saying he's a journalist from Uganda. What role can African youths play in shaping policies and advocating for climate change during and after COPs? And what significance is discussions like we are having now towards the attainment of climate goals? Samuel, I think your last question has been answered by Mark, who told us the purpose of COPs, that it's really a meeting that gives political mandate to parties. Parties in this case refers to countries. So they get there, they discuss, and they are given political mandate to go and some sort of framework to go and discuss what the roadmap, what actions they want to take over the next 1 year, and then they go back and evaluate. So that is the significance of COP. But what is the significance of this webinar? There are so many people who are getting interested in attending COPs and they do not know what to do. So the purpose of this is to give you a sense of direction that when you show up, what should you be doing? What should you be talking? Whom should you be talking to? Pablo has told us the conversation starts way, way before, so that you can have an impact, immediate or later, on that political mandate. So I request that you limit yourself to the first part of the question. Maybe African youth or youth generally, what role they can play in shaping policies and advocating for climate change during COPs. Also, please talk to us about the youth COP that some people are unaware about.
So I think the first thing I want to do is tie back into what Pablo said about getting organized. Join an organization, find other people that are fighting for the same thing. There is absolutely strength in numbers. And I think that is especially the case when we're talking about youth. Young people often have a lot of time and energy, but very little resources and money. So if you want to get access to those resources and money, you're going to have to join up with other people. That's, I think, the most important thing I can say. Try to organize with other people. As it comes to the role of shaping policies and advocating for climate change, I think it's really important to engage in the youth-specific events. I think it's really important to reach out to your local government. Very often, they will be very interested in having youth voices heard, even if that's just, looking nice for the media. They have a bunch of young people talking with their minister. Take the chance. Let your ministers get their plus points from the media while you get a few words in. It is worth it. So try to really leverage the fact that you are youth. You do get access to spaces that you maybe wouldn't have otherwise. Beyond that, there is also the Conference of Youth, which is organized by Youngo. This is about climate change then, so the UNFCCC. And Youngo is a UN organization for youth invested in climate change, and it's a mess. So if you are going to join it and engage in it, be ready for that, because it is very complicated and it's not very well structured. But it's absolutely an entry into the UN space, which I think is very hard to get as young people, and I would assume especially in the global south. So take advantage of those chances that you do have. Get active in Youngo if you can, and if you can, go to a Conference of Youth, because that will really give you youth voices and youth inputs and youth connections, which I think is also really important. That you do lose a bit of strength if you are organizing as a young person, if you're organizing with people that aren't youth, because then it's very hard to say we are youth. But if you're organizing with only other young people, you do have a very strong message to say that we are the youth of the world. And I think that's very impactful. And that's what I think we should keep in mind. But I do think that organizing is the absolute best way forward. Get together with other people, join organizations, join movements, and pick a niche is something that I would say. I didn't do this for very long. I was active in everything and anything, and I fought for everything that was going to make the world better. And you will not have time and energy. Pick something. And I know that sounds really that's a really harsh message, but I think it's really important that if you really want to have an impact, you have to specialize. You have to pick a field, you have to pick a way forward that you're really, really passionate and ready to fight for and put all your hours into, because you can't be spreading yourself too thin.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, Samuel, I hope that answers your question. And to let you know that at We Planet Africa, we are running, I don't know why these people start banging their things when I start speaking, but apologies for the background noise. We are running a campaign on clean cooking energy. And that means that, COP is usually 12 days. That means that for me, for who will be there representing our agenda, it's really of paramount importance that I'm there on Energy Day. And other days, I don't necessarily have to be there because those are not the niches. That is not the issue that is taking me to COP. So you don't have to go for all 12 days. Look at the agenda, find out what particular day is your issue going to be discussed, plan to be there a day before, and you can always leave the next day or something like that. So that's what Iya is saying, find a niche. You're not going to go and advocate for everything and anything. Sorry, Tyron is saying COPs have grown really huge. We love it so that we can all attend, tens of thousands of people. So his question is, should activists reconsider whether their attendance is necessary? And how do they work out whether their attendance will be impactful? So still the second part of your question, Tyron, has been answered severally by all our speakers in one way or another. I will ask Mark to respond to the first part of the question. Should activists reconsider whether their attendance is necessary or not?
I'm not sure the second part has been answered, actually, of Tyron's question, because he's asking about corporate lobbying and big money going into the process. And the problem, and I'll just address this. If that's all right. I mean, the difficulty with these things is that they're very invisible and very non-transparent. So there'll be closed door meetings going on all the time, and you won't even know about them, particularly if they're off-site. I mean, so a company could like book a room in a big posh hotel. There's drinks, there's nice food, and so there's ways in which they can seek to influence delegates, perhaps unduly in some people's eyes. I actually think that this problem can be overstated, though. I don't think, from what I've seen informally, I don't think corporate power is that suited to COPs, actually, or even to the UN system. NGOs actually are much more powerful, I think. They tend to be much louder and much better organized and more impactful in many different ways. And you only tend to notice that when you're against what the NGO is asking for, which occasionally happens, when the big NGOs are wanting to, get rid of nuclear or something, and we think nuclear is important for clean energy production. And so you then realize how powerful they are when they win their battles, if you're actually on the other side from them. So it isn't, there's lots of different sources of power and influence within these negotiations, and money buys something, but it doesn't actually buy that much influence in the real world, I don't think. On the first part, should activists go to COPs? I mean, I suppose the argument against is the flying and the carbon emissions and stuff. So it's always going to be a judgment. You can't have any impact at all if you're not there. You've got to be in the room in these kinds of situations, or your voice won't be heard at all. So that's the judgment you got to make. If you're well organized and you think you can do something which is worthwhile and will have an impact, you could end up changing the world. So it might, in that situation, well be worth the flight.
Okay. Iya or Pablo, any of you wants to add? Yes, Pablo.
Yeah. I do want to add. I think Mark said it well at first. We all have a role to play in these negotiations. That's why there's different lanes, if you can. In terms of when you get there, I think I'll leave the decision of you to go or not to go in you. But in terms of being impactful, I would think there's two buckets, maybe. If you don't know anybody and you haven't been to COPs before and you're just starting this, I would recommend you go for this first start of the COP, because what you want to do is build up your network. You want to talk to as many delegates as you can before, and you're trying to get in leeway before they actually make a decision. Closer to the end of the COP, they'll probably already have a position, and they'll probably already be working really hard to get that position into the negotiations. But if you're haven't been to many COPs, try and do the first part of the COP. So you make networks and you make connections and you join teams and you join other people with similar values and similar objectives as you. Now, if you are experienced and if you have connections and you built up a network already, then the last part of the COPs will always be very important, because I love Ia's story and it's such a great example that if that small word that she caught nobody else caught it. And that can happen because we're humans, and everybody, if you saw the level of stress that all these delegates have, it's really quite remarkable. They're really, really running on fumes at the end of these meetings. And more if you're from a country like Guatemala or other countries in the global south, where they don't have a lot of manpower. And so they're really, really dividing all of their brain power into thousands of topics. And so that's where, for example, Ia's story comes in. If you are at that end part and you can catch, and you've done your homework, you followed the negotiations, you know what's happening, then your contributions can be great, because then you can highlight, exactly as the example said, something that everyone else missed. Or what's more, you can put forth your own experiences. Maybe you have a specific experience that has impactful on the negotiation. You can say, no, the assumption you are making as a government negotiator is wrong, because I've lived through that and this is what really happens. And that voice can be in the plenary, it can be in a side event, it can be in the corridors. So then it's really, so it depends your state of play of where it's important to be and where it's, and when it's important for you to be there.
Great, thank you, Pablo. You keep referring to you know, what parties or countries are going to decide, but maybe just to clarify that I don't know whether all COPs call this the nationally determined Mark, what's the word? Nationally determined priorities, let me say.
You're not talking about NDCs, are you? Nationally
No,
determined
the NDPs.
NDCs,
Like
I mean,
the
those...
country. Yes, NDCs, like what the countries decide. Yes.
So yes, I mean that's that's reflective of the bottom-up approach that the COP takes. So it's up to countries to suggest what actions they're going to take. So there's a nationally determined contributions. So that's what the NDC means. And it's worth pointing out that there's so many acronyms and different letters floating around on these. The latest one, which is going to be big in Baku, is NCQ. Nationally, it's the new collective quantified goal, NCQG, I think, from finance, F. So, I mean, some of these acronyms are just insane, but everybody will be talking about them, and you really need to know what they are if you want to influence them, because these things actually do matter a lot. So it's lots of buzz phrases. Loss and damage is another buzz phrase. That was the big one in Sharm el-Sheikh a couple of years ago. Adaptation, which is mentioned in the chat by Samuel, I think, you know, adaptation financing, those are big things as well. And all of these things have different acronyms and lots of different very technical processes attached to them. So it is complicated, and that's why I'd reinforce what Pablo says, is you've got to focus on one very specific area. So maybe you're going to focus on clean cooking, like you said, Patricia. Maybe you're going to focus on deforestation, or maybe you're going to focus on, you know, adaptation financing of a particular type in East Africa or something. And that's, you know, unless you're heading a government or, you know, a senior member of a government delegation or one of these big international groups, that's probably where you're most likely to have an impact.
Okay, great. So thank you, Mark. What the point I was making on NDCs is that these documents are actually public. You can go to the UN website and get them and pick the particular document for your country and go through it beforehand, so that when you're talking to your, you know, government representative, you know what they have suggested. And if you want to suggest otherwise, then you're speaking from within the framework that they have already created. People are not creating new frameworks at COP. They have given it a bit of thought. And we are only 6 minutes into our time. I would like for our panelists, I'd like to say thank you for joining us today and to give your last remarks. But in your last remarks, please help me respond to Samuel's final question very briefly. He's asking how people in the Global South can secure funding and resources for climate policies. Yes. I think finance is the theme for this year's UNFCCC's COP. That's what everyone is going to be talking about. But your final remarks, and then how then can people in the Global South secure finance? Mark, no, Ia, please go first.
Okay, I will start by posting the UNFCCC NDC registry. You can look at them. So you don't have to fuck through their database on your own. They are right in the chat. Second on that, on the financing issue, I think it's really important to talk about really the fact that funding is hard to get for literally everyone, and don't be afraid to ask people for it. Especially don't be afraid to ask your national government for it, because very often, at least for youth, they're like, oh, you want to go do funny thing for our country? That sounds fun. And then they'll let you. So like that's like my main key thing from that. Don't be afraid to ask. If you need the funding, ask around. The worst thing they can say is no. And then as for my final remarks, I think it's really important that we keep in mind why we are at COP and what we're fighting for at COP, and that like we attend COP because we are trying to make a better world, and that we need to keep that in mind. And like we can't be compromising on too many things. And like even if compromise is obviously very important to reach an end goal, we need to be careful with who we compromise with and how we do it to maintain the fact that we do also need a world to that is worth living in, and not just a world that can be lived in.
Thank you, Ia. Pablo, your final remarks.
Yes. So addressing the question, I agree with Ia. Ask, and then basically I'll double down on everything I said. There's no way out of it. If you want to go to COP, you're gonna have to do the work. And to do the work, know what you're interested in, and take that and put it into a one-pager. Explain why it's important for you to go, what you want to achieve there, and who you are. And then send it around to everyone and their mothers. It's just get the word out there that you want to have impact, and be clear on why you think you can make impact. And then start with another thing we've all talked about, start in the organizations that do that type of thing. If you're youth, go to all the youth organizations and see if there's a way for you to get in there. That one pager will serve you well regardless. Go to your government if you're a specific, depends of the observer. And also go to international organizations. They usually have something or a lot of different organizations have allocated funds for traveling for different experts or for different groups. And so just knock on doors, but get prepared. And then my final remarks is just to thank Patricia and We Planet for all their work, because I have heard, or this sense of deflation of feeling like you're too small to matter. And yeah, these COPs are huge monsters and there's a lot to go through. But if there's not more organizations like We Planet and that do this type of activities, even if it's small, there's this nugget of information and insights that I hope everyone gets. And if no other people do it, then the system will just continue to be filled with bottleneck processes that all the people that are not experts will be kept out. So thank you, Patricia, for the invitation, and thanks, Mark and Ia, for great comments.
Sure, thanks, Pablo. It's always great speaking with you again. Mark, your final remarks.
I am glad I get the last word. The last word is always important, particularly at a COP. I would say your title for this was COP's not for tourism. I think COP is also a little bit for tourism. A lot of people do go and have a day out. There's the middle weekend when you're not really supposed to do any work. There's some quite big parties. So take your glad rags and be prepared to have some fun as well. And actually, it's probably the best way of meeting people actually is at a party rather than, formal events. And you can meet all sorts of people. Like you can find yourself talking to a government minister or some important journalist or who knows what. Yeah. The other thing is the dress code. I think it's probably worth mentioning, actually. You are expected to dress quite formally if you're going to be in the plenaries or in any of the sort of formal negotiations, or even hosting a side event or something. But, for a party, you've got to look good as well. So take a variety of different changes of clothes. I remember there was a journalist at a COP a few years ago who always wore this yellow suit, like very impactful yellow suit, except he wore it for 14 days. and by which time it wasn't quite so yellow. And actually, one of the government spokespeople on the podium sort of even called out and said, it's really about time you change your suit. So people do notice these things, and you've also got to look good at a COP.
Funny. Thank you very much. I have shared the UNFCCC Observer Handbook. Please go through it. It's very detailed. This recording is going to be on our YouTube. We Planet Africa. If you need to re-listen, please do. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Ia. Thank you, Pablo, and everyone for joining us today. One action item as we leave. Please follow us. We Planet is not just in Africa. We are all over. Please follow us on Twitter or whatever your social media platform of choice is. We Planet and We Planet Africa. We are the same. So please do follow us and let's keep in touch. Thank you very much. And gentlemen, you don't have to put on navy blue, really, the tyranny of navy blue at these events. You can put on yellow. It's allowed. And yeah, just to mention that youth actually stops at 35. So if you're 35, don't think